I was recently asked to speak to a group of antique runabout owners. And I started my presentation and they wanted to know what kind of boats that I worked on. And I said, well, I work on wooden runabouts, but I also work on real boats. Well, that was out of my mouth before I realized who I was speaking to. What I meant to say is I work on a variety of, small lake boats and large seagoing boats and whatever. So I hope I don't put my foot in my mouth this time. And also, just keep me abreast on time so I don't go too far. If you would indulge me just a little bit, I brought a few slides of the types of boats that I do, that I restore in my shop. I have a fairly large shop with about 20 boats going all at one time. We do antique wooden boat restorations. I've built some new boats from scratch, but it seems I don't have time for that. There are so many wooden boats around that people are bringing them to me, and I've got a long backlog, so that's where all of my focus is. What I'm finding is just about every boat I get has some kind of story that is tied to someone else and tied to somebody's grandfather, and there's a big connection there. And I just brought a couple of slides to show you that. And change. There we go. Very good. Here's an old Chris Craft sea skiff. You can see that it's clinker built and obviously needs a lot of work. As we were stripping the old paint off, we found the etchings of an old name written in the sides, and it said Canoe Island Lodge. Well, this was from 1957, so I just happened to Google it and found that their lodge is still in operation, and they sent me a picture of the actual boat with at least 13 people in it. And so there's the tie-in there, and then find out that the grandfather actually went to that lodge, so quite a wonderful tie-in. Here's an antique 1952 17-foot Chris Craft runabout that had been sunk underwater for about 3 months. If you look carefully in the bottom, you'll see a fish. So we called this the fish boat, and it stunk for months. And here she is after restoration, going around to shows and winning awards. Here's an 30-foot Alden that was literally sinking as we got it. When we hauled it out to save it, the mast crumbled and fell to the ground. We did a complete deck-off restoration, traditional caulking, Carville planked mahogany. There's the new spar. And here she is now. Came out very well and is now on her way back to Maine where she belongs. Here is a Herreshoff Rozinante, a gorgeous boat, double ender, rather unique. Came in for some minor flooring repairs and some touch-ups. And there she is, completed at the marina. Unfortunately, and Miss Emmy, and unfortunately the marina had a fire, and so did the boat. It's now at the International Yacht Restoration School in Newport, Rhode Island, undergoing its second major restoration. Here is a little 10-foot Dyer Dink that someone bought on eBay for a few $100. As we were cleaning it up, we noticed a highlight of the name on the transom. So after some investigation, we tracked down the hull number and the original owner and found that it was the tender for the large motor yacht Wasp, which was owned by the Wrigley Company out of Chicago, as in Wrigley's chewing gum. And so you can see a few $100 eBay find became, a major find. And those stories are always wonderful to see. Well, thank you for indulging me with that. I am also, in addition to restoring wooden boats, I'm also a SAMS surveyor specializing in small yachts and pleasure craft. It's a little bit of a fine line that I walk. I can't work on boats I survey, and I can't survey boats I work on. Fortunately, that hasn't been a problem for me. I specifically work on wooden boats, and I survey everything else. And being in an area where there are no other surveyors, it's worked out well for me. Excuse me. I'll go over some of the fine points of wooden boat construction, particularly as it relates to smaller pleasure craft. And what I mean by smaller is, say, less than 8 meters, 30, 40 feet, trailerable boats, as we would say. As I've worked on these, I found that the production boats are pretty much defined by 2 time periods, pre-war and post-war. So before 1940 and after 45, 46. After the war, they were pretty much production boats, built just in a production facility, just like an automobile. They were meant to last 8 to 10 years, not 80 years. So the scantlings are very thin. They're just big enough and just strong enough to hold together for a little bit. They look gorgeous. It seems like most of the effort went into making it look good rather than making it run well. So we find that the structure is weak, where you would have a frame, a futtock joint coming down to meet with a bottom frame. They would just put 1 bolt through it, and well, you know, that wouldn't hold anything. It would just pivot and move. So that's some of the things that we're dealing with, is trying to make it better and stronger so it'll last another 50, 60 years. Here are a couple of different types of constructions that we see. Most of the mahogany runabouts are built on the plank and batten construction. Most of the sides are plank and batten, and the bottom is double planked. Originally, between the 2 planks on the bottom, they would just trowel in an old style bedding compound made with linseed oil and lead, great stuff. And then they would put a layer of canvas over it to help hold that in. Well, after about 8 or 10 years, that has all washed away or rotted, and there's nothing between there. So it's just 2 layers of wood that have to swell tight together to become watertight. And after a few years, that's not going to happen. They're gonna keep leaking, and that's pretty much our bread and butter, is putting on new bottoms. Okay. So the plank and batten we see a lot of. Clinker type or lap strake construction is another fairly popular type. It's a little more, I won't say seaworthy, but it's a little more sea-kindly structure, just due to the overlapping of the joints. It holds up better. It doesn't prevent rot any less. We find that due to the frame construction, it actually holds water and causes rot. So you're trading strength for rot resistance. And that's where maintenance of a boat is really important. Here are some tools. When I'm doing a survey, obviously there's never been a flashlight that's been too bright. Even during the day, you need to look down in the bilge, and the brightest flashlight A small hammer. I know some people used to survey wooden boats with an awl or some kind of pick where they could poke in the wood. I don't like that. I don't think that's a very good way. But even on fresh new wood, you can take an ice pick and push it right through the wood. I prefer a slotted screwdriver where I can hit the wood with the grain or against the grain, and I can feel what it looks like. I can use the blade to pry between planks and use it more as a general all-around tool. And then the back end becomes my hammer for tapping, percussive sounding, if you will, to check for rot or other separations and delaminations, things like that. There's also a Phillips head screwdriver and a Frierson screwdriver. Has anybody ever heard of a Frierson screwdriver? Okay. Okay. Well, here's something. For some reason, and I don't know why, bronze screws are the head are either slotted or a screw that looks like a Phillips screw, but microscopically it is not. There is a slight difference. If you look on this picture, you'll see that there's a Phillips head, and then the Frierson is a square driver. And if you have a Phillips screwdriver bit and you are trying to remove a bronze Frierson screw, it's going to not fit properly and it'll strip it out and you'll have problems. Right. They were also called reed and prints. So you might know that term. Right. So it would be good to have, if you're going to be doing any wooden boat surveys, if you look at the screw and you can determine that it's a bronze or brass screw and it's not slotted, it's going to be Frierson. Now, why the makers of bronze screws used that type, I don't know. That would be an interesting story. That's for next time. But that's just something for your tool bag to keep in mind, that if it's a steel screw or a stainless steel screw, it's going to be a Phillips. When I'm doing a survey, a bottom survey, we have to test the fasteners, and usually I'm the one removing the screws along the keel and along the underside just to check the status of the fastener itself. So when I'm doing that, I will lay out a pattern on the boat, and it depends on the marina. Sometimes the marina will want to have their person remove the screws. If not, they have me do it. I will start at the garboard, because the garboard plank is always the worst plank, the one right next to the keel. All of the oil that leaked out of the engine is going to be right there in the bilge, and it gets the most work between the broad planks, whether it's lap strake or clinker or Carville plank construction. That garboard always seems to be a problem. So I always start there and then work my way up. And if you know what the inside of the boat is, where is the head, where is the water heater, internal fittings, wherever there's something unusual, that's where you're going to find problems. So if there is a leaky pump or something like that, right around there, that's where a good place to check fasteners. You don't have to pull a lot, but one or two, and you know what kind of trouble you're in for. And then you can make a determination from there. A lot of times I will uncover the putty or the bung or whatever is inside there, and if you put the screw on it, it might just crumble away. If you look and you see one bronze screw and two stainless steel screws, well, somebody was in a hurry to get that plank back on, and they just put in whatever they had. It's really interesting to see the unusual things that are done in a hurry to get a boat back in the water. It can be quite a mess. Okay, here's the inside of a runabout. This is a 17-foot runabout, but the construction of a lot of these boats from 15, 20, 30 feet large is almost exactly the same. You're going to have a keel meeting the stem with some type of gripe or knee construction. They're going to be through bolted and screwed, and in that joint, that's where also you're going to have that very typical old style bedding compound, which has long washed away, and you're going to get a lot of leaks there. I find that when I get a boat in my shop, I can reach down with my hands and unscrew all of those nuts. They're that loose. So they're really not doing much work. This larger plank on the sides coming together at the stem is the chine. And that chine joint where it meets the stem is usually just tied in with the end grain with 1 or 2 screws. And they were hoping that the outer planking would help hold it together. So a fairly weak joint. So all of these are converging right at that frame forward where the stem, the gripe, and the chine logs come together. That's a great place to look. When you get to these boats, you're going to find that they're covered with floorboards and life jackets and all sorts of trash from over the years. So a lot of cleaning out has to be done before you can get in there. You're right. Yeah, dead fish. Here's another look at that stem to keel gripe, that joint, and you can see that they're screwed together. Here's the gripe right here. The keel ends about here, and the stem ends here. And all of this is a large joint that is going to leak and weep. And you can see the dark color on that. That's oil staining. We've cleaned this boat several times, and you can see that it's still oil covered. And an oil-soaked piece of wood is not going to hold paint or any kind of adhesive, and the screws will loosen and back out. So if it's really oil-soaked, it's got to be replaced. I'm sorry, could you say? I'm sorry? No, please do. And we can maybe even make this available to you. Yes. This boat is upside down. Right, and we have the bottom off. This is the chine here. This is the stem. See, here's a little bit of the water line. So this is the top sides, and here's the keel and the frames. Does that make sense now? Yeah. Okay. So here's some of the loose bolts. Most of the runabouts or smaller craft had lifting eyes, so they could be lifted straight up. It's just held, you're lifting 2 tons by one large 5/8 inch bolt with threads. So that's a lot of force to be trusting to one bolt. I haven't dropped one yet, but we always check this setup. This plank is bolted to the ribs and to the structure, and they're all in there, but that's another great thing to look at, to check the security of those lifting eyes. Here is another place to look for problems. You have futtock, which is the vertical frame coming down, and then the sawn bottom frame coming up, and here's the chine, and you can see there's one bolt going through here and one bolt going to attach the chine to the frame. It's a fairly weak joint. As the boat's all put together, it becomes strong, but individually by itself, it's going to twist and move in a fairly weak joint. I tell you what, let me back up to this. On the chine, if you notice, here's the chine here. I'm hoping that everyone at home can see this too. On this chine here, if you notice, the top of it angles out. So any water is going to hit here and not drain into the bilge, but be trapped right along this plank. So over time, dust, leaves, and weeds, whatever, birds' nests, squirrels' nests, will end up on there, and when it gets wet, it's going to hold water right against that and obviously rot. So another good place to check. Again, none of these can be seen without removing the floorboards and the ceiling boards. And if the marina or the owner doesn't do that, that's something that I do. That's why I bring my Frierson screwdriver and my Phillips screwdriver, and it just takes time to get in there. The aft running gear of most of these boats are very similar throughout many of the brands, many of the ages. This could be a pre-war boat or a post-war boat. They had really nice bronze castings, and it looks like they used them even up until today. A couple of things to check. Of course, you see a blower here. They're not going to have a blower. That's something that we've added. The ventilation is very poor. However, these 4 bolts here in the middle are for the propeller strut. And this big board here ties in the engine stringers to the frames and to the strut, a very strong tie-in point. Over time, being in the bilge, you'll see this rotted and those bolts just sucked right down into the wood. So a very tight area to check. The limber holes here, you want to make sure that those are clean so water can flow in and flow out. Here's the rudder post back here. That is also a point that as the wood expands and contracts, it's going to almost unscrew those bolts. Each season, they seem to work a little bit more and a little bit more. So as it dries up, you can just take that rudder and flop it around. And it's going to leak. It's hidden behind the fuel tank, so nobody thinks to look there. But if you can get in there, maybe if you use a camera or a borescope or just reach in there blindly, you can feel, you could probably grab those nuts on those bolts and turn them by hand. It's usually that loose. Okay, and you can see the 2 exhaust hoses run along, and there's about 1 inch between the bottom and the top in the fuel tank. Everything is very tight, even on the largest boat. They seem to cram everything in one small space. So here's a close-up of those bolts and the bracing that I was talking about. Very critical spot to check. Fortunately, these boats are easy to get to from underneath. So checking the running gear, the strut, the rudder is fairly easy. You could probably grab the rudder and shake it, and it might flop all around. And there should only be maybe a few millimeters worth of play in that rudder. But sometimes you can grab them and shake them all around. Same thing with the strut. If you notice, this one has some kind of wedge that has been put underneath. The way to align the engine to the coupler is usually to adjust the strut rather than adjust the engine. The engines had fixed engine mounts, so they were not easily moved. So it's easier to move the prop shaft than it is the engine. So it's common to see wedges and putty and epoxy and all sorts of weird things underneath here to make everything line up. It's very easy to get to the Cutless bearing, so you can check the roundness. If you look between here and here, there's quite a large space. It should be evenly touching that rubber all the way around. And you can see on the top, it's off. And they were wondering why it was vibrating so much. Well, there you go. You just need to realign the engine, okay? Some other small items just to check. It seems that when these were designed, a lot of the underwater hydrodynamics were not primary in their design. They wanted to know where can they put the engine so they can put another seat in. Not do we have the right angle of pitch or how far the prop is from the strut. All of those details that are fairly common now were not thought of. I find that the propellers are almost touching the hull of the boat. So the distance between the prop and the hull is, you can barely stick your finger in there. So you get a lot of cavitation. Sometimes the bottom of the boat is just worn away just from cavitation or sand, or maybe even the prop hitting it. The clearance between the prop and the strut, I see it either touching or several inches away. Either way, it's not within standards that we would think appropriate for this time right now. Does that make it a bad boat? I don't know, but it's something that needs to be addressed or at least noticed on your report. Many of them, because of the angle of the engine, the angle of the propeller going in the water is very steep. Some of them, when they were experimenting with V-drives, were able to get the shaft further forward and get a better angle. But you'll find that the shaft angle is very steep and makes for a very inefficient planing surface. It makes the boat porpoise as it's going down the lake. But it's a varnished boat with lots of shiny things on it, so people like them. I've also had the prop hitting the keel or the bed log. When you're looking underneath, the shaft coming out through the wood is actually rubbing on the wood, and it's polished the shaft away. And rather than cut the wood away, I've seen people actually mill the shaft so it's smaller at that point. It's amazing what we see out there. And the same thing with the bed log, which is not something you will see until you pull the boat apart, but you've had bronze rubbing against bronze for decades, and at some point something's going to give, and either the shaft is going to break or warp, or it's going to wear a hole right through the bed log and constantly leak. The rudder posts, just because people are running aground or hitting a log or a rock, are often damaged and bent, and then they've been pulled out, and rather than replaced, it's just been pounded back straight and put back in for another season. So the damage to those lower running units are, fortunately, they're visible, they're obvious, but they seem to always be there. So if you're crawling around on the ground looking at rudder posts, you'll see a lot of ugly welds and a lot of movement in those planks. Now, the engines. that is another whole story, but just a brief discussion of engines. Very few of them are safe. Most of them still work, but they are the original 1920s, 1930s, 40s that work for, you know, it's a 95 horsepower and it weighs 950 pounds. And it's a big chunk of cast iron and it'll last forever. But the carburation, the electronics, the ventilation is minimal at best. I see leaks of fuel and oil all the time. They just do that. They can't do that. But the owners, oh, it's always leaked like that. Well, that's something that has to be repaired. If it's maintained properly, it will run well and it will be safe. However, they did not come with proper wiring. Many times, particularly pre-war, the ground circuit coming from the rear of the boat for the stern light or the fuel sender was the copper fuel line, was actually the negative conductor. So electrically it worked, but using a fuel line or going forward, there was a copper oil line that went to the oil pressure gauge that was used as the negative run of wire from the engine to the gauge panel. So obviously, you know, at the time it seemed to make sense, and so far that boat hasn't blown up. So, right, yes. I'm sure there are stories where they did blow up, but so those are some real interesting stories. So there was no overcurrent protection whatsoever. Later on in the 50s, there were a few inline fuses installed under the dash for some items. All of the lines running from the battery and the generators forward to the ammeter are straight. Of course, nothing's marine wiring at the time. They were wrapped in cloth wrapped wire, pounded in with metal staples, and for some reason they worked. But the wiring is horrible, and that's the first thing we do is rip out all of the old wiring and put in all new wiring, all to ABYC standards as best as we can. Add proper circuit breakers at the engine before it goes forward, and then individual branch circuits underneath the dash for each individual circuit. The navigation lights are not wired properly. There was just one switch, so they were either all on or all off. There was no provision for a separate anchor light or running lights, no bilge blower. These are all the things that we add that technically reduce the originality of the boat. At my shop, the originality, rarely do I worry about originality. These are not show boats. These are user boats. And when they leave my shop, they have to be proper. They have to be safe. I can't send people out in boats that might blow up or sink or flip over or whatever. So we try as best we can to add proper ventilation, which means cutting a hole in a deck that never had a vent and adding additional vents, adding passive ventilation as well as powered ventilation. Larger vessels, we add fixed fire suppression systems in the engine rooms or even in the engine boxes if they're big enough. Sometimes we'll have, if you see a boat that comes into your shop and it has 3 bilge pumps in it, all wired with no fuses, you know you've got a leaky boat. Usually they'll put 2 in the back because as you're running down the lake, all the water's going to run to the back. And the little siphon hose that was originally put in there has plugged or had sunk the boat previously, so they've plugged it up. Now they need 2 bilge pumps in the back just to keep the boat afloat. It's really interesting what we see out there. In late 50s, 1958, 59, the engines switched from a standard inline 6 engine to this new Magic V8. A lot more power, smaller, lighter weight, still just as many problems. Many of them had poor carburation, a lot of fumes, a lot of smoke, a lot of leaky oil. Fortunately, they've gotten better, but those are some of the things that we tend to look for. Any questions about any of your... I'm sure everybody has stories of old antique wooden boats. These right now are the power boats. We are fortunate enough to have real boats, sailboats, everything from a small International 12, which is just a little 12-foot dinghy, and they have come to me from the Netherlands. I have one in the shop now from Japan, and at the time I've tried to track down the types of wood, because we would build a boat out of oak frames and white cedar planking. Well, these boats were made from oak frames and cedar planking, but it's Japanese oak and Japanese cedar, or English oak, or whatever it is. It seems like no matter where you go, you can find oak. Somebody has some kind of oak somewhere. And of course, teak and mahogany. I am fortunate to live in an area of the United States that used to be called the furniture capital of the world. So the infrastructure for bringing in these exotic woods is there. There are still dry kilns drying large quantities of mahogany. So I can still get mahogany. The furniture industry has gone elsewhere as business goes, but we're still able to get the woods we need to do the construction that we have. All right. We have a question coming in.
For British boats, we used to use English oak for the framing. Very often we would use Canadian rock elm, about which I'll tell you a story, for stringers and longitudinals. And the planking was usually mahogany, if you could get it,
right?
Spanish mahogany,
right?
Or teak, which was better,
right?
And the replacement for that was what we used to call Irish teak, otherwise known as Iroko,
right?
Which is a fairly good timber.
Right.
On one boat we built, we put in a new stringer with of Canadian rock elm, and rock elm does tend to rot in odd places. And we just finished the job, and we were expecting the surveyor to come, when one of the lads said to the charge hand, "This piece of timber is rotten. We've got to rot here." So the charge hand came over and looked at it and said, "Yes, it is. Everybody put your coats and your toolboxes over that," which is what we did. The surveyor came in, looked at it and said, "Fine, that's all okay," and sent the boat off. Off my that also got done for it.
I'll have to remember that technique.
Every time I do a boat, I see a pile of toolboxes, move that lot.
Right.
Yeah, I'm just going to ask before it comes in. Gary, I have a very serious question.
Uh-oh.
It's interesting. So I talk to so many surveyors these nothing but grief. So can you give people a little bit of confidence?
That is a very good point. I hear that too. You know, if somebody gets a wooden boat to survey, rather than doing the survey themselves, they would call someone else, call me. I would rather work on the boat than survey the boat. But realistically, a boat is a boat. You're going to have a keel. You're going to have some kind of planking. The structures are the same. You're looking for the same types of things. The only difference is the rot in the wood and the fasteners. Those are the two things that you really have to spend some time on. It might be worth me bringing in some rotted wood next time and looking at some things. And that's where, you know, if you push too hard on a good piece of wood, you're going to put your tool through it, and even though it's still good.
There was a case, I don't think it's even in the public domain yet, but a surveyor, I remember from IIMS, who looked at a classic vessel, quite a famous classic vessel, and did a survey, and the owner of the vessel was not convinced by the survey report, which came back with a clean bill of health. The boat was moved to a yard elsewhere in the UK, and the surveyor came on board, put his screwdriver into the deck and just went straight through.
Right.
It was a big court case.
Yeah.
That one's a big number.
Right.
So there are pitfalls. There are things to be mindful of.
There are. I looked at a boat that just had a fresh coat of paint, and I tapped around the outside, and it looked pretty good. I looked on the inside, and the planks were hidden by ceiling boards that were nailed in with ring nails, you know, a century ago. So in order to get to the interior of it to check it, we found it easier to remove planks on the outside. You can get to just drill out the bungs, unscrew the fasteners, pull the plank off. Once we did that, we found that the outside of the plank was okay. The inside, about half of it was rotted throughout the whole boat. So as you're tapping, you don't notice the difference between good and bad. It's all bad, so it sounds uniform. But we couldn't tell until we pulled it apart. And a lot of times you can just, you know, pull out some seats or joinery on the inside and look. This time we couldn't. It was all nailed, and without a chainsaw, we couldn't find out. So pulling off a plank on the outside, I'm comfortable pulling off planks and putting them back on. If you're not into that, that's why, you know, it's probably at a boatyard where you just say, in order for me to do this, I need to have you remove these screws and pull this plank off. And if they're not willing to do that, then you really can't, you know, certify this as a solid vessel. If you can get to the inside and the outside of the plank reasonably, you're probably okay. In salt water, we see a lot of, the wood seems to last longer, but the fasteners will corrode faster. In freshwater, it's just the opposite. The fasteners will last, but the wood will rot. So knowing the history of where the boat has been most of its life, or where the boat will be spent, makes a difference on the type of fasteners, the type of wood, what you look at. If you look at a few fasteners and they're all good, and it's going to be in fresh water, you can pretty much assume that they're pretty much all pretty good, and vice versa. If you have a boat that has spent all of its life in salt water and they're going to pick it up and put it on the Great Lakes or some freshwater body, it's going to change the chemistry of the boat. Wooden boats tend to be almost like a living organism itself. You know, the frames are even called ribs. So, you know, almost some of these boats you expect to take a breath. So the sum of the parts really have to be looked at as well as each individual piece. Okay. Yes.
To look at Alden from Norway. You mentioned that you found on all types of boats, you found lead and canvas to seal off.
Right.
What is your preferred method and materials to replace that?
Very good question.
When you are storing vessels today.
That's a very good question. The method we use is what we call the 5200 method. Okay, and that is fairly much an industry standard right now. The bottoms are double planked, and if you know, on some brands they were single planked with battens, which is a problem in itself, that they trap water. So we remove the battens and we make those double planked bottoms. Between the two planks, we trowel on 3M 5200, which is a polyurethane adhesive that is moisture cured. Very strong. Once they're put together, it's permanent. They're not going to come apart. So if I have to do a repair after that, I'm grinding it off like it's a composite boat. The good thing about it, it is a very strong adhesive, and it's flexible. It's like a hard rubber. So as the wood expands and contracts, the adhesive will expand and contract with it. There was a time, particularly throughout the 80s, where that adhesive was epoxy, which sounds like a good idea. But if we're using solid mahogany on the outside and plywood on the inside, they're going to expand and contract at different rates. And for the first few years, the boat is going to be great. It's going to look solid and smooth. But as it expands and contracts and dries, something's got to give. And it's usually the plank inside or that epoxy joint. So we pretty much, a lot of the boats that were made in the 80s, there were some replicas of the high-end Hackers and triple cockpit Chris Crafts and things like that, were built with epoxy bottoms, and we have since pretty much replaced all of those. They just didn't last. It trapped water in, and then as wood cracked, more water got in, and it cracked and fell apart. If you have dimensionally stable bottom, for instance, a layer of plywood with another layer of plywood, that's basically a cold molded boat. Epoxy will work at that point because you don't have very much expansion and contraction. One thing you do have is a very solid boat that was almost like a fiberglass boat on the hull, but it was supposed to be soft, flexible wood. So you're going to get a different ride. It might pound a little bit different. It might sound different. So you're microscopically changing the handling characteristics of a boat. So that's why we use the 5200, which is more flexible and gives. Thank you. And could we get the microphone? We have another question.
We had to drive it out of wedges and delaminate at the bottom.
Right.
It was so strong, the bond, it was there without any keel bolts in. And we drove wedges, it was pretty parts of the laminate. That's how strong it is.
Right, right. That 5200, it's not meant to come off. It's a very strong adhesive. So you only put that on something you never want to come off. If you're bedding through hulls or deck fittings with that you're going to have to take off seasonally to repaint, you're in trouble. We have found that heating it, if you come in with a blowtorch and get something hot, or heat up a putty knife and slide it through, that will do it, but you're still going to be there all day trying to remove that without breaking the boat.
When we built double diagonal boats, we used to put paint and calico between the two skins, and that always worked until the calico rotted. It lasted usually about 15 years. After that, it was totally useless.
Right.
But going back to plastings for a moment, did you ever use copper nails changed on roads? You might call them rivets.
Right, yes. The nails and roves or rivets we do use. Actually, that the train going by. On the smaller boats, that 12 International 12 that I spoke of is riveted with copper rivets. Some of the smaller canoes are copper clinch nailed or copper riveted. So we do see copper on smaller, lightweight vessels, canoes, kayaks, lake boats, but rarely on anything that's going to be in salt water or anything heavily built.
We built quite a number of lifeboats, and they were usually about 20, maybe 25 feet long. They were always fastened together with copper nails clenched on ropes. If we had a big boat to deal with, we used tree nails, treadles.
Right, right.
And they were difficult to drive and even more difficult to get out.
Right, yes, that's where I guess you'd have to drill them out.
You can't.
Oh, okay.
We had a barge to break up once, and it was done with dovetail treadles, put in at different angles. We couldn't break the bloody thing up, we had to burn it. Okay, any more?
Do we have any online questions? Did we have some online questions? Sir, we're getting another question.
How do you deal with delignification?
Delignification, that's a good question, and we actually do see that as often as we see rot. Delignification is the destruction of the internal cells of the wood itself. It's almost like eating away the sugars of the wood, the lignins, and leaving just a dry honeycomb of the leftover wood. Angel hair, that's exactly what it looks like. That's a very good description. Where the wood will start to look fuzzy on the outside, and if it's really bad, it will look very porous and lightweight. We treat that like rot. If there's delignification of a plank or any piece of wood, that piece has to be replaced. So it's just as insidious as rot, although it doesn't creep like rot spores. Sometimes if you have a large boat and you have one end of a plank, the hood ends at the transom might be rotted up 3 or 4 feet. You can go in and cut it off where it seems solid, and in a couple of years later, where that rot left off, it will continue to grow. Those microscopic rot pores will travel through the grain quite a distance from where the obvious rot is. So if you have one end of a plank that's rotten, the full plank should be replaced. If it's a fairly long plank and only a few inches are rotten, you could probably come in and give it plenty of room and make a joint Most of the joints that we do when we're doing repairs are scarf joints rather than a butt joint. Are people familiar with scarf joints? Is that a fairly, yes, great. And on a boat that's in place, that's quite a chore. If you've got the new pieces of wood and you can put them on a workbench, it's fairly easy to plane a scarf in a joint and get it just right. But as it's curving and twisting on a boat, and you've got to curve and twist in a new piece, that's where I am fortunate to have a really wonderful crew of artists that can think and look and work three-dimensionally as things twist. And that's where epoxy is a great help.